For 6 months, Dean Martin walked past Sammy Davis Jr. like he didn't exist. No eye contact, no hello, no acknowledgement that they'd ever been friends. The Rat Pack was falling apart, and nobody knew why until Sammy discovered the heartbreaking truth that Dean had been hiding from everyone. It was October 1964, and something was terribly wrong in the most famous friendship in Hollywood. Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., who had been inseparable for over a decade, were now treating each other like strangers. The man who used to call Sammy Smokey and Little Brother was now walking past him in hotel hallways without so much as a glance. The Rat Pack had built their legend on brotherhood, on the idea that fame and fortune meant nothing if you didn't have friends to share it with. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop weren't just performers who worked together. They were a family that had chosen each other. But by the fall of 1964, that family was fracturing, and nobody understood why. It had started so gradually that at first, Sammy thought he was imagining things. Dean seemed distracted during their performances at the Sands Hotel in Vegas. He wasn't staying for the after-show parties that had become legendary among Hollywood insiders. He was leaving immediately after the curtain fell, claiming he was tired or had other commitments. Then came the missed phone calls. Dean had always been the first to call when any of the guys had good news or needed support. When Sammy's television variety show was renewed for another season, Dean's congratulations never came. When Peter Lawford got divorced, Dean wasn't there to offer comfort or a shoulder to lean on. But it was the silence during the group dinners that really worried everyone. Dean Martin had always been the heart of the Rat Pack's social dynamic. He was the one who kept everyone laughing, who smoothed over tensions with a joke and a drink. He was the guy who made Frank feel relaxed, who made Sammy feel included, who made the whole group feel like they belonged together. Now Dean sat at their regular table at Jilly's in New York, or the Copa Room in Vegas, nursing his drink and barely participating in conversations. When someone asked him a direct question, he'd give a short answer and then retreat back into his own thoughts. "What's wrong with Dean?" Frank asked Sammy after a particularly uncomfortable dinner in November. "He's been acting like his dog died for 2 months." Sammy had been wondering the same thing, but he'd been afraid to bring it up. "I don't know, Frank. I've tried talking to him, but he keeps saying everything's fine." "Everything's not fine," Frank replied. "The guy looks miserable, and it's affecting the whole group." That's when Sammy made the decision that would lead him to the most painful discovery of his career. He was going to find out what was wrong with Dean Martin, no matter what it took. His first stop was Jeannie Martin, Dean's wife. If anyone knew what was troubling Dean, it would be her. But when Sammy called their Bel Air home, Jeannie was as mystified as everyone else. "Sammy, I'm so glad you called," she said, her voice heavy with worry. "I've been hoping someone from the group would reach out. Dean won't talk to me about whatever's bothering him. He comes home from work, has dinner with the kids, and then locks himself in his den with a bottle of scotch until bedtime. Has he said anything about the group? About work? About any of us?" "That's the strangest part," Jeannie replied. "He won't even watch your television show anymore, and you know how proud he's always been of your success. When your name comes up in conversation, he just changes the subject." This information hit Sammy like a physical blow. Dean Martin had been one of his biggest supporters since they'd first met in the early 1950s. Dean had been the one who'd convinced Frank to include Sammy in the Rat Pack. He'd been the one who'd stood up to racist club owners who didn't want a black entertainer in their venues. He'd been the friend who'd celebrated every success and offered comfort during every setback. Sammy's next conversation was with Joey Bishop, who was known as the group's observer, the one who noticed things that others missed. "I've been watching Dean for months," Joey said when they met for lunch at the Brown Derby. "Something's eating at him, but it's not what you might think. It's not his marriage, it's not his health, and it's not money problems." "Then what is it?" Joey looked uncomfortable. I think it has something to do with you, Sammy." The words hung in the air like an accusation. "With me? What could I have possibly done?" "That's just it. I don't think you did anything. But I've noticed that Dean's mood seems to get worse whenever your career is going really well. And lately, your career has been incredible." It was true. 1964 had been one of the best years of Sammy's career. His television variety show was a ratings hit. He'd released 2 successful albums, and he just signed a movie deal that would make him one of the highest-paid entertainers in Hollywood. While he'd been celebrating these successes, he'd been so focused on his own achievements that he hadn't noticed his best friend falling apart. The conversation with Joey led Sammy to pay closer attention to Dean's behavior, and what he observed broke his heart. Dean Martin, the smooth, confident performer who seemed to glide through life without effort, was struggling with something much deeper than professional jealousy. During their performances, Sammy watched Dean more carefully. The man who used to command the stage with effortless charisma was going through the motions. His famous smile looked forced. His jokes felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous, and his singing, while still technically perfect, lacked the joy that had always made Dean Martin performances special. More troubling was what Sammy observed backstage. Dean was drinking more than usual, not just the social drinking that had always been part of the Rat Pack lifestyle, but serious, steady drinking that started before performances and continued long after the audiences went home. He was isolating himself from everyone, not just Sammy, but he seemed to be avoiding Sammy most specifically. The breakthrough came in March 1965, during what would turn out to be one of their last performances as the complete Rat Pack. They were at the Fontainebleau in Miami Beach, and Dean had been particularly distant all week. He'd skipped the group dinners, avoided the late-night parties, and barely spoke to anyone except when absolutely necessary for the show. After the final performance of their Miami run, Sammy made a decision. Instead of going to the after-party that Frank was hosting in his suite, he went to Dean's room and knocked on the door. "Dean, it's Sammy. We need to talk." The door opened, and Sammy was shocked by what he saw. Dean Martin, usually immaculately groomed and perfectly dressed, looked terrible. His hair was disheveled, his shirt was wrinkled, and his eyes were red-rimmed from too much alcohol and too little sleep. "Sammy, this isn't a good time," Dean said, trying to close the door. But Sammy put his foot in the doorway. "Dean, please. It's been 6 months since we've had a real conversation. What did I do wrong? What happened to us?" Dean looked at his friend for a long moment, and then something in his expression cracked. "You didn't do anything wrong, Smokey. That's the problem. I don't understand." Dean stepped back and let Sammy into the room. The suite was a mess, empty bottles on the table, room service trays with untouched food, clothes scattered everywhere. This wasn't the Dean Martin that anyone knew, the smooth, controlled performer who seemed to have everything figured out. "Sit down," Dean said, pouring himself another drink with hands that weren't quite steady. "I guess it's time someone knew the truth." What Dean told Sammy over the next hour was the most honest conversation they'd ever had, and it explained everything. "You want to know why I've been avoiding you?" Dean said, settling into a chair across from Sammy. "Because every time I see you, every time I watch you perform, every time I hear about another one of your successes, I'm reminded of what a failure I've become." "Dean, that's crazy. You're one of the most successful entertainers in the world." "Am I?" Dean laughed bitterly. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at my career, Sammy. I see a guy who got lucky with a few songs and some movies, but who never had to fight for anything. Everything was handed to me because I'm white, because I'm tall, because I fit what people expected a star to look like." Sammy started to protest, but Dean held up his hand. "Let me finish. Then I look at you, and I see someone who had to be twice as good as everyone else just to get noticed. Someone who faced discrimination, hatred, and prejudice every single day, and not only survived it, but became more successful than any of us. Someone who can sing better than Frank, dance better than Gene Kelly, do impressions better than anyone in show business, play multiple instruments, and still find time to break down racial barriers that had existed for decades." Dean's voice was getting thick with emotion, and Sammy realized his friend was crying. "Every time I stand next to you on stage, I'm reminded that I'm just a lucky guy with a nice voice, while you're a genuine artist who earned every single thing he's achieved. And lately, watching your career explode while mine feels like it's just coasting, it's been killing me." "Dean, I know it's pathetic," Dean continued. "I know it's selfish and stupid and unfair to you, but I couldn't handle being around you anymore because it made me feel like such a fraud. Here you are, fighting for civil rights, breaking down barriers, using your success to make the world better, and what am I doing? I'm making the same movie over and over again with Jerry Lewis, singing the same songs, living off my reputation. Sammy sat in stunned silence as Dean poured out months of accumulated self-doubt and depression. This wasn't professional jealousy in any simple sense. This was a man questioning his entire worth, his entire identity, in comparison to someone he genuinely admired and respected. The worst part, Dean said, is that I know you would have helped me through this if I'd just talked to you about it. But I was too proud, too embarrassed, too afraid that you'd see me the way I was starting to see myself. When Dean finally finished talking, Sammy moved his chair closer and put his hand on his friend's shoulder. Dean, do you want to know what I see when I look at you? Sammy said quietly. I see the man who convinced Frank Sinatra to let a black entertainer join the Rat Pack when that was still controversial. I see the guy who walked out of clubs that wouldn't serve me dinner, even when it cost you money. I see someone who made me feel like I belonged in rooms where nobody else would have welcomed me. Sammy's voice was steady, but his eyes were filled with tears. You think you haven't earned your success? Let me tell you something. Talent without character is worthless, and you have more character than anyone I've ever known. You stood by me when it would have been easier to look the other way. You defended me when people said things behind my back. You made me feel like a member of your family when the rest of the world was trying to remind me I was different. Dean looked up at Sammy, hope and skepticism fighting in his expression. The reason my career has been so successful, Sammy continued, is because I had friends like you who believed in me before I believed in myself. You didn't just stand next to me on stage. You stood up for me in life. That's worth more than any amount of talent. They sat in silence for several minutes, both men processing months of misunderstanding and pain. Finally, Dean spoke. I'm sorry, Smokey. I'm sorry I shut you out. I'm sorry I let my own problems mess up our friendship. I'm sorry I was too much of a coward to just talk to you about what I was going through. Dean, we all go through dark periods. We all question whether we deserve what we have. The difference is that you don't have to go through it alone. That's what friends are for. What followed was the longest conversation Sammy and Dean had ever had. They talked until sunrise about success and failure, about friendship and loyalty, about the pressures of fame and the importance of staying grounded. Dean admitted that he'd been drinking too much, that he'd been pushing away everyone who cared about him, and that he'd been seriously considering quitting show business altogether. Sammy helped Dean understand that his contributions to entertainment went far beyond just talent. His generosity, his loyalty, and his willingness to stand up for what was right made him irreplaceable, not just as a performer, but as a human being. By the time the sun came up over Miami Beach, the friendship that had been broken for 6 months was not only repaired, but stronger than it had ever been. Dean had learned that vulnerability didn't make him weak, and Sammy had learned that even the most confident people sometimes need reassurance that they matter. The change in Dean was immediate and noticeable to everyone. At their next performance in Las Vegas 2 weeks later, he was back to his old self, relaxed, funny, and genuinely happy to be on stage with his friends. The chemistry between him and Sammy was electric, and their on-stage banter felt natural and spontaneous for the first time in months. Frank noticed the difference immediately. Whatever you two worked out, he told them after the show, it saved the Rat Pack. We weren't the same without both of you being yourselves. The renewed friendship between Dean and Sammy became the foundation for some of the Rat Pack's best performances over the next few years. But more importantly, it became a model for how real friendship works. Not just celebrating successes together, but helping each other through the dark times when self-doubt and fear threaten to destroy everything you've built. Years later, when Dean Martin was asked about the secret to the Rat Pack's longevity, he always told the same story. The most important thing I learned about friendship, he would say, is that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that you're struggling, and sometimes the most important thing your friends can do is remind you who you really are when you've forgotten. The 6 months when Dean Martin ignored Sammy Davis Jr. became a cautionary tale that both men shared privately with other entertainers facing similar struggles. It was a reminder that success doesn't protect you from self-doubt, that fame doesn't cure insecurity, and that the people who care about you the most are often the ones best equipped to help you find your way back to yourself. Their friendship lasted until Dean's death in 1995, But it was never quite the same as it had been before those difficult 6 months. It was deeper, more honest, and more resilient, because both men had learned that true friendship requires not just loyalty and fun, but also the courage to be vulnerable and the wisdom to help each other through the inevitable struggles that come with being human. If this story of friendship, vulnerability, and redemption moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to struggle, and that asking for help doesn't make you weak, it makes you brave. Have you ever had a friendship that survived a difficult period because you were honest about your struggles? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the human side of legendary entertainers.